Fern wouldn't stop screaming. The sound bounced off the marble walls of the Cross mansion like a death sentence waiting to be delivered. "Hush, baby, hush," Soline begged, her voice cracking as she pressed her daughter against her chest. Her uniform was soaked with sweat. Her arms ached from bouncing the 11-month-old for the past 40 minutes. But nothing worked. Nothing ever worked when Fern decided to cry. Mrs. Thornbury appeared at the end of the corridor, her face twisted with panic. "Are you insane?" she hissed. "He's in his office. He can hear everything." Soline's stomach dropped. She knew exactly who he was. Stellan Cross, the Phantom, the man who'd built his empire on the bones of anyone foolish enough to cross him. She'd taken this job out of pure desperation. 4 months behind on rent, medical bills piling up from Fern's premature birth, an abusive ex who'd vanished and left her with nothing but bruises and debt. She didn't have a choice. "I tried to find someone to watch her," Soline whispered, tears burning her eyes. "The nanny canceled. I've called everyone. I've got no one left. You won't have a life left if he—" The words died in Mrs. Thornbury's throat. A door slammed somewhere in the mansion. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, getting closer. "Run." Mrs. Thornbury mouthed the word, then disappeared around a corner like smoke. But Soline couldn't run. Her legs had turned to concrete. She could only stand there, clutching her screaming baby, watching as Stellan Cross rounded the corner and stopped. He was taller than she'd imagined. Broader. A scar sliced down the left side of his face from temple to jaw, pale against his skin. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, and just as lifeless. He wore a black suit that probably cost more than Soline would earn in a year. Blood. She noticed suddenly. There was blood on his knuckles. Fresh. "You." His voice was terrifyingly soft. Soline flinched as if he'd shouted. "I'm sorry, sir. I know I shouldn't have brought her. The nanny had an emergency and I couldn't find anyone, and I can't afford to lose this job because my daughter needs her medication and—" "Stop talking!" Soline's mouth snapped shut. Fern continued to wail, her tiny body trembling with the force of her cries. Stellan's cold gaze dropped to the baby. Something flickered across his face. Something Soline couldn't read. "How old?" 11 months, sir. She was born premature. She spent 2 months in the NICU. She doesn't like strangers. She won't let anyone hold her except me. Even doctors have to sedate her for checkups. She's terrified of everyone. I'm telling you this because—" Stellan extended his hand toward Fern. Soline's heart stopped. "Sir, please." She'll scream louder. She'll make it worse. "I'm begging you. Just let me leave and I won't ever bring her again. I'll figure something out. I'll—" Fern's crying stopped. The sudden silence was so shocking that Soline forgot how to breathe. Her daughter's head lifted from her shoulder. Those big blue eyes, still wet with tears, locked onto Stellan Cross with an intensity that didn't make sense. And then Fern smiled. Soline had never seen her daughter smile at a stranger, not once in 11 months. But Fern was smiling now, reaching toward this man with both arms, making grabbing motions with her tiny fingers. "No," Soline whispered. "Baby, no." Fern whined and squirmed, fighting to get to Stellan. Her little body strained forward. Her hands opened and closed desperately. She wanted him. This monster. This killer. Her daughter wanted him. "Give her to me," Stellan said. "Sir. Now." Soline didn't know why she obeyed. Maybe it was fear. Maybe it was the strange certainty in his voice. Maybe it was the way Fern was looking at him like he was the only safe place in the world. She handed her daughter to the most dangerous man in Chicago. And Fern, her screaming, inconsolable, terrified of everyone baby girl, wrapped her arms around Stellan Cross's neck and let out a sigh of pure contentment. The Mafia boss stood frozen. His bloody hand hovered uncertainly near the baby's back. His cold eyes had gone wide. For one impossible moment, he looked almost human. "She's never done that before," Soline breathed. "With anyone. Ever." Stellan didn't say anything. He just stood there, holding this tiny fragile life against his chest, looking like a man who'd just been handed something he didn't know how to hold. If this moment gave you chills, hit that like button right now. Share this story with someone who loves unexpected twists. And subscribe because you won't want to miss what Stellan does next. Sometimes the deadliest hands are the safest place to fall. Stellan turned and walked away without waiting for Soline's reaction. Fern still had her arms wrapped tightly around his neck, her blue eyes shut fast, her breathing steady, as if she'd found the safest place in the world. Soline stood there for 1 second, then another, her mind refusing to process what had just happened. Her feet moved before her thoughts could catch up, following the man who was carrying her daughter as if it were the most natural thing in the world. They passed through a long, cavernous corridor, past expensive oil paintings hanging on the walls, past perfectly manicured flower arrangements. Each of Stellan's footsteps echoed with calm certainty on the marble floor. Each of Soline's steps trembled behind him. The double oak doors opened, and Soline stepped into an entirely different world. Stellan Cross's office was as large as the shabby apartment she was renting. The ceiling soared high above, crowned with a glittering crystal chandelier. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed the full sweep of Chicago, skyscrapers gleaming like a forest of diamonds in the night. The walnut floor was polished so smooth, Soline could see her own reflection in it. A massive black mahogany desk sat at the center of the room, holding a slim laptop and an antique brass desk lamp. A towering bookshelf covered one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked as though they'd never been opened. But what stole Soline's breath wasn't the luxury. In the corner of the room stood a glass cabinet stretching from the floor to near the ceiling. Inside, arranged neatly on black velvet mounts, were at least 20 firearms, handguns, rifles, weapons she didn't even know the names of. They gleamed under the lights, maintained with the care of priceless works of art. Soline swallowed hard. This was his world, a world of blood and guns and death, and her daughter was sleeping peacefully in the arms of the man who ruled it. "Sit down," Stellan ordered, his chin tipping toward the black leather chair opposite the desk. Soline sat. She didn't have a choice. Stellan walked around the desk, one arm still supporting Fern securely, then lowered himself into his chair. He adjusted the child's position with a care that was strangely gentle, settling her head against his shoulder, his large hand covering nearly all of Fern's tiny back. Dried blood on his knuckles smeared against his expensive suit. He didn't seem to care. Stellan's cold gray eyes locked onto Soline. In the office light, she could see the scar on his face more clearly. It ran from his temple down to his jaw, jagged and brutal, telling a story of violence she didn't dare imagine. Now, his voice was still calm, still terrifying. "You're going to explain to me why you thought bringing a child into my house was a good idea." Soline drew in a trembling breath. She knew she should lie. She should make up a story that sounded less pitiful. But those gray eyes were looking straight through her, as if they could read every thought in her head, and she knew lying to this man would be the final mistake of her life. "My daughter's babysitter called at 5 in the morning. She began, her voice rough. Her mother had a stroke. She had to fly to Florida immediately. I made 17 phone calls. 17. No one could help." "Why?" Stellan asked, his eyes never leaving her. "Why could no one help you?" "Because I have no one." Soline heard her voice break. "My parents died in a car accident when I was 16. I don't have brothers or sisters. No relatives. Friends left me a long time ago because..." She stopped. "Because what?" "Because my ex-boyfriend." Soline looked down at her hands clenched tightly in her lap. "He didn't like me having friends. He didn't like me talking to anyone. He didn't like me doing anything he didn't allow." A heavy silence passed. When Soline looked up, she saw that something in Stellan's eyes had changed. They were still cold, still unreadable, but something darker lurked behind them. Something dangerous. "He hit you." Not a question. A statement. Soline nodded, her throat tightening. "For 2 years, I didn't dare leave because he threatened to kill me. Then I found out I was pregnant." She glanced at Fern, her daughter still sleeping peacefully on Stellan's shoulder, unaware of the painful memories her mother was dragging into the light. "He beat me when I was 7 months pregnant. Beat me so badly I was hospitalized. She was born 2 months early. She weighed less than 2 kilograms. The doctor said she might not survive." Soline's voice caught. "Fern spent 62 days in an incubator. 62 days I sat beside her, praying, begging anyone in heaven or on earth to let her live. And while that was happening, he disappeared. He left me with his gambling debts in my name. He left me the hospital bills. He left me an apartment with 4 months of unpaid rent." Tears streamed down Soline's cheeks, but she didn't bother wiping them away. She was too tired to preserve her dignity. Fern's immune system is very weak because she was premature. She needs medication. She needs regular checkups. She needs things I can't afford. I was fired 3 times because I had to take time off to care for her when she was sick. This job..." She lifted her gaze and looked straight into Stellan's eyes. "This job was my last chance. If I lose it, my daughter and I will live on the street. So yes, I knew bringing her here was insane. I knew who you are. I knew you could kill me just for inconveniencing you. But I didn't have a choice. When faced with a certain firing and a chance of being killed, I chose the chance. Because at least there was hope. Soline stopped, her breathing shallow and fast. She'd said too much. She knew it. But once she started, she couldn't stop. Everything she'd held back for nearly 2 years poured out like a broken dam. The office fell into silence. Stellan said nothing. He only watched her with an expression she couldn't read. One arm still supported Fern, his thumb unconsciously brushing the child's back. Fern stirred in her sleep, made a small murmuring sound, then tightened her arms around Stellan's neck, and Soline saw it, just for a moment. Stellan's gaze softened as he looked down at the child in his arms, just a second before the ice returned. "What's his name?" Stellan asked, his voice dropping into something terrifying. "The man who did these things to you. What's his name?" Soline froze. She realized that question wasn't born of curiosity. It was a promise. A promise of violence, of revenge, of terrible things that would happen if she answered. Soline shook her head. "It doesn't matter," she said quickly. "He's gone. I don't know where he is, and I don't want to know." Stellan studied her for a long moment, gray eyes sharp as blades. Soline had the uneasy sense that he didn't believe her, or at least that he knew she was hiding something. But he didn't press, not now. He stood, still holding Fern, as if the child weighed no more than a pillow. He walked toward the window, gazing out at the city shimmering below. Fern shifted, her head nudging in search of a more comfortable place on his shoulder, then sank back into sleep. Stellan stood there in silence for nearly a full minute. Soline didn't dare move. She didn't dare breathe. She simply sat there, waiting for her sentence. Fired. Or worse, she'd prepared herself for both. "You and the child will move in here." Soline was certain she'd misheard. "What did you say?" "There's an apartment in the east wing of the estate," Stellan replied, still not turning around. 2 bedrooms. Fully furnished. "You'll move in this afternoon." Soline shot to her feet, her heart pounding out of control. "Sir, I don't understand. What are you saying?" "I'm saying you'll live here." Stellan turned back, his face cold as stone. "I'll hire a professional nanny to care for the child while you work. I'll cover all of her medical bills, and you won't have to worry about rent anymore." Soline felt the room spin. None of this made sense. Men like Stellan Cross didn't help anyone without a reason, without a price. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why are you doing this? You don't know anything about me. I'm just a cleaner." "I don't understand why you would." "Because of the child." Stellan cut in, his gaze dropping to Fern. "She trusts me. She shouldn't trust me. No one should trust me. But she does." He fell silent for a moment, his thumb still brushing the child's back without thought. "I'm not used to that feeling." Soline didn't know what to say. She stood there, watching the most powerful man in Chicago hold her daughter with a gentleness she'd never seen in anyone, not even the child's own father. "But I can't accept this," she finally said. "I don't want to owe you anything. I don't want to." "This isn't an offer." Stellan stepped toward her, and Soline had to force herself not to step back. He stopped right in front of her, towering over her by nearly a foot, his shadow falling across her like a dark cloud. "You don't have the right to refuse." Soline's blood boiled despite her fear. "Then what am I?" she demanded, her voice harder than she intended. "A pawn in your game? Something you can buy with money?" "I'm not. You're a mother who's starving so her daughter can eat." Stellan cut in, his voice sharp with ice. "You're a woman sleeping 3 hours a night because you're working 2 jobs. You're someone who was willing to stand in front of me, in front of death, because you had no other choice." He tilted his head, studying her closely. "I'm not buying you. I'm giving you an opportunity. Whether you take it or not is your choice. But if you refuse because of foolish pride while your daughter needs medicine, then you're worse than the men I've killed." The words struck Soline like a slap. She wanted to scream at him, to say she didn't need anyone's pity. But then Fern shifted, letting out a small, soft sound in her sleep, and every shred of pride inside Soline collapsed. She looked at her daughter. The fragile child, pale and thin, always sick because Soline couldn't afford the right medication. The child sleeping on a thin mattress in a cold apartment because Soline couldn't pay for heat. The child who deserved more than Soline could give. "All right," Soline whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll stay. For Fern. Only for Fern." Stellan nodded, as if he'd never doubted the outcome. "Mrs. Thornbury will take you to the apartment," he said. "Your belongings will be moved within 2 hours. The new nanny will start tomorrow." He looked down at Fern once more, and for a brief moment, Soline saw something soft pass through those cold eyes. "And now," he said, "let the child sleep. She seems to like it here." The apartment wasn't an apartment at all. It was a dream Soline had never dared to have. Mrs. Thornbury led her through the oak door, and Soline had to steady herself against the wall to keep from collapsing. The living room was spacious, with cream velvet sofas, soft fur rugs, and wide windows overlooking the perfectly manicured gardens of the estate. The open kitchen held a refrigerator filled to the brim with food, the kind of food Soline hadn't been able to afford for months. Fresh fruit, whole milk, beef. She had to turn her face away so Mrs. Thornbury wouldn't see her tears. The master bedroom held a double bed with pristine white sheets and a feather duvet so thick, Soline wanted to leap onto it and cry. But it was the second room that finally broke her. Fern's room. The walls were painted a pale mint green, with hand-painted butterflies and flowers drifting around the window. A white crib with a cushioned mattress and soft blankets sat in the corner. Shelves overflowed with plush animals, colorful stacking blocks, and cloth books for infants. The wardrobe opened to reveal rows of tiny outfits, dresses, rompers, socks, hats, all brand new, all exactly Fern's size. She prepared all of this, Mrs. Thornbury said, her voice warmer than Soline had ever heard it, within 2 hours. I don't know how he did it. Soline stood in the middle of the room, tears running freely down her cheeks. She thought of her old apartment, where Fern slept on a thin mattress on the floor, where Soline layered 3 old blankets over her child because she couldn't afford heat. She thought of the nights she lay awake, listening to her daughter wheeze from the cold, feeling like the worst mother in the world. And now this room, this warmth. She didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Gratitude, fear, both. A knock at the door pulled Soline from her thoughts. She wiped her tears quickly and opened it. An Asian woman stood outside. She looked to be in her 40s, dark hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck, her face calm but her eyes sharp as razors. She wore a simple black outfit, yet the way she stood, the way she observed, carried something unusual. "I'm Miss Hayashi," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "I'll be Fern's nanny starting tomorrow. Mr. Cross asked me to come introduce myself first." Soline invited her in, still trying to read this woman. Miss Hayashi entered the apartment with the alertness of a cat, her eyes sweeping every corner as if searching for something, or someone. "Do you have experience with children?" Soline asked. "I have experience with many things," Miss Hayashi replied, a thin smile touching her lips. "You don't need to worry. Fern will be safe with me." The way she said safe sent a chill through Soline, not from fear, but from the realization that Miss Hayashi wasn't just a nanny. That night, after feeding Fern and placing her in the new crib, Soline lay on the bed unable to sleep. Everything still felt unreal. That morning, she'd been a cleaner on the brink of losing her job. That night, she was lying on sheets with a thread count she didn't even dare imagine. A faint sound made her sit up sharply. Footsteps outside the apartment door. Soline slipped quietly from the bed and moved toward the door. She didn't open it. She only looked through the peephole, and her heart stopped. Stellan Cross stood outside her door. He didn't knock. He didn't do anything at all. He simply stood there in the darkness, staring at the door with an expression she couldn't read. One hand lifted as if to knock, then fell, then lifted again. He stood like that for nearly 5 minutes before finally turning away and disappearing into the shadowed corridor. Soline leaned back against the door, her heart racing. She didn't know what this man wanted. She didn't know why he'd stood outside her door in the middle of the night. But she knew one thing. Her life would never be the same again. The first week passed like a strange dream. Soline wasn't sure she wanted to wake from. Her job changed completely. No more scrubbing floors or wiping glass doors. Thornbury assigned her a small desk in the office wing, where she organized documents, sorted correspondence, and learned how to function inside the intricate world of the Cross estate. The work wasn't physically demanding, but it required absolute focus. Every sheet of paper could hold a secret. Every name could represent a life. Soline learned not to ask questions, not to look too long, not to be curious about the meetings that took place behind Stellan's closed doors. But what she couldn't stop thinking about wasn't the work. It was the evenings. At exactly 7 o'clock every night, not earlier, not later, there was a knock at the door, and when Soline opened it, Stellan Cross stood there. He never explained. He never asked permission. He simply stepped inside, walked straight to Fern, and sat down beside her. 15 minutes. Exactly 15 minutes every evening. The first night, Soline stood in the corner, tense and watchful. She didn't know what to do. She didn't know what to say. But Fern did. The moment the child saw Stellan, her blue eyes lit up. She crawled toward him as fast as her small legs would allow, arms stretched out to be picked up. And Stellan, the coldest Mafia boss in Chicago, bent down and lifted her as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Fern wrapped her arms around his neck, her head resting against his shoulder, making happy little sounds. Stellan didn't speak much. Occasionally he asked whether she was eating well, whether she was sleeping enough. Short questions directed at Soline while his eyes never left Fern. Then he simply sat there, holding the child, letting Fern play with his tie or pat his cheek with her tiny hand. On the third night, Fern fell asleep on Stellan's shoulder. He sat motionless for 20 minutes, not daring to shift, not daring to breathe too deeply, afraid of waking her. When he finally laid Fern in the crib, his movements were so gentle, Soline couldn't believe these were the same hands that had taken lives. Rumors spread through the estate like wildfire. Soline heard them in whispered conversations in the kitchen, in stunned looks when she passed by. "He visits the child every night," one servant said. "I don't believe it. Whose child is that he cares so much?" "Not his," another replied. "Just the cleaner's baby. But the child clings to him, like he's her father." Mrs. Thornbury was the only one who wasn't surprised. "In 20 years working for the Cross family, I've never seen him like this," she told Soline on the 5th day, as they sorted files in the records room. "He doesn't like children. He doesn't like anyone getting close." But Fern, she shook her head, her expression both puzzled and amazed. "That child does something to him. I don't know what, but he's different." Soline didn't know how to respond. She saw the change too. On the evenings when Stellan sat with Fern, his face softened. Not much, just a little. Enough for Soline to glimpse the man behind the ice. Enough for her to start wondering who he really was. On the 7th night, as Stellan prepared to leave, Fern began to cry. She clutched his jacket, refusing to let go, tears rolling down her chubby cheeks. Stellan stood there helplessly, looking down at the crying child with an expression Soline had never seen on his face. Confusion, pain, as if Fern's cries were tearing something apart inside him. "I'll come back," he said to the child, his voice rougher than usual. "Tomorrow, I promise." Fern didn't understand the words, but she understood the tone. She stopped crying, hiccuped once or twice, then reached up to touch his cheek. Stellan closed his eyes, just for a second, but that second said more than any words ever could. When he left that night, Soline stood by the window watching his figure fade into the corridor. She thought about what Mrs. Thornbury had said, about the change, about the man behind the Mafia boss, and for the first time since coming here, she felt something other than fear, something far more dangerous: curiosity. On the 9th night, Soline's nightmare became real. She woke at 2 a.m. to a weak cry from the next room. It wasn't Fern's usual cry. This one was different, whimpering, in pain. Soline leapt from the bed and ran into her daughter's room, and her heart dropped into the abyss. Fern lay in the crib, her face flushed red, her hair soaked with sweat. When Soline touched her forehead, she almost screamed. "Hot, burning hot." "No, no, no," Soline whispered, her hands shaking as she lifted the child. Fern cried weakly, her head falling against her mother's chest, her tiny body trembling. She was breathing fast and shallow, each breath like a blade cutting into Soline's heart. She had seen this before, in the intensive care unit, when Fern had just been born, when doctors rushed back and forth with worry they tried to hide. Weak immune system, they had warned her. A simple fever for a normal child could be a death sentence for Fern. Soline held her daughter tighter, tears streaming down her face. She didn't have money to call an ambulance. She didn't have insurance. She didn't have anyone. "You'll be okay," she whispered, not knowing whether she was speaking to Fern or to herself. "Mommy will find a way. Mommy will." The bedroom door flew open. Soline turned, her heart racing. Stellan Cross stood in the doorway, hair disheveled, his shirt wrinkled as if he'd sprung straight from bed. His gray eyes swept the room, landed on Fern, and something dangerous flared within them. "What happened?" His voice was sharp as a blade. "She has a fever," Soline said, her voice breaking. "A high fever. I don't know what to do. I don't have money to call a doctor. I don't." Stellan pulled out his phone before she could finish. He dialed a number and said only 4 words. "Get here. Right now." Then he hung up and stepped toward Soline. "Give her to me." Soline didn't hesitate. She placed Fern in his arms, and immediately the child stopped crying, still breathing fast, still burning hot, but no longer crying. As if simply being in Stellan's arms made everything bearable. "The doctor will be here in 15 minutes, Stellan said, his eyes never leaving Fern. "My private doctor, the best in Chicago. She'll be fine." He said it like an order, as if he were commanding the universe itself not to harm this child. 12 minutes later, a middle-aged man arrived carrying a medical bag. He examined Fern quickly and professionally, prescribed medication, explained how to reduce the fever. "A mild respiratory infection," he said, "not serious for a normal child, but with her immune system she needs close monitoring. I'll return in the morning." When the doctor left, Soline let out a shaky breath, but Stellan didn't leave. He sat down in the chair beside Fern's crib, the child still in his arms, and looked at Soline. "Go to sleep," he said. "I'll watch her." Soline shook her head. "I can't sleep. She's sick. I have to." "You need rest," Stellan cut in, his tone allowing no argument. "You're close to collapsing. You won't help her if you get sick too." Soline wanted to protest, but she knew he was right. She was exhausted, terrified. She hadn't slept properly in months, in years, and now, watching Stellan sit there with Fern in his arms, his face focused and grave, she felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Safe. She didn't leave the room. She couldn't. But she sat down on the floor, leaned her back against the wall, and drifted into sleep while Stellan kept watch over her daughter. When she woke, the first light of morning was slipping through the curtains. Stellan was still sitting in the same position. He hadn't moved. All night, Fern slept peacefully against his chest, her breathing steadier now, color returned to her cheeks. And Stellan, dark circles shadowing his eyes from lack of sleep, was looking down at the child with an expression Soline couldn't name. Tender, protective, painful. As if he were gazing at something precious he knew he didn't deserve. "Don't give up, little one," he whispered, not knowing Soline was awake. "You're stronger than you think. You have to be stronger than you think." His voice caught for a brief moment before he steadied himself. And Soline, sitting there in silence, tears streamed down her face. She wasn't crying from fear anymore. She was crying because she had just witnessed something no one else ever might have. The breaking heart of Stellan Cross. Fern recovered after 3 days. 3 days during which Stellan came not once but twice a day, morning and evening, to check on the child's condition. 3 days during which his private doctor remained on call, bringing expensive medications Soline knew she'd never be able to afford. 3 days during which she looked at this man through entirely different eyes. On the 4th day, when Fern could smile and play again, Stellan summoned Soline to his office. She stood before his desk, spine straight, forcing herself to appear calm while her heart pounded wildly. She didn't know what he wanted. Maybe he was tired of this arrangement. Maybe he wanted her gone. Maybe. "You're observant," Stellan said abruptly, cutting through her thoughts. Soline blinked. "Sir?" "Yesterday, when the doctor examined Fern, you stood in the corner." Stellan rose and walked toward the window, his back to her. "What did you see?" Soline didn't understand the question at first, but she replayed the moment in her mind. The doctor examining Fern, her watching, and what she'd noticed. "He was worried," she said slowly. "Not about Fern, about something else." He kept checking his watch. His hand trembled slightly when he wrote the prescription, and when he left, he glanced toward the gate, as if he were afraid someone was waiting outside. Stellan turned, his gray eyes sharp as knives. "What else?" Soline hesitated for a second. His phone vibrated 3 times during the exam. He didn't answer. But after each vibration, he looked toward the door. "And the last time, I saw him swallow. Like he was scared." Silence. Stellan studied her with an expression she couldn't read. Then he nodded, a thin smile brushing his lips. "That doctor is in gambling debt," he said. "Loan sharks are pressuring him. I knew last week, but you saw it in 10 minutes. Soline didn't know how to respond. She simply stood there, waiting. "You're intelligent," Stellan continued, stepping closer. "You survived 2 years with an abuser. You raised a child alone with nothing. You stood in front of me when everyone in this estate trembles." He stopped in front of her, close enough for her to see the sharp lines of his face, the scar running from temple to jaw. "I need an assistant," he said. Not the kind who just files papers. Someone who can read people, who can sense danger before it happens, who can think under pressure. Solon felt dizzy. You want me to be your assistant? I'll train you, Stellan said, his tone allowing no argument. You'll learn to read people, detect lies, analyze situations. You'll sit in meetings and tell me what you see. Your salary will be 5 times what it is now. And Fern will have everything she needs. Solene wanted to refuse. She wanted to say she didn't want to sink deeper into his world. But then she thought of Fern, of nights when the child was sick, of the uncertain future waiting if Solene had nothing to stand on. And she thought of Stellan, the man who stayed awake all night holding her daughter, the man who whispered to Fern as if the child were the most precious thing in the world. All right, she said, her voice steadier than she expected. I agree, Stellan nodded, as if he'd never doubted the answer. We start tomorrow. And as Solene left the office, she knew she'd just stepped through a door she could never walk back from. 2 weeks passed in a whirlwind of lessons and observation. Stellan taught Solene how to read body language, how to catch the smallest signs of deception, how to tell the difference between fear and someone hiding something far worse. He showed her recordings of past meetings and asked her to analyze every person in the room. She learned quickly, faster than he'd expected. And in the 3rd week, he decided to test her in the real world. The meeting took place in the estate's main conference room. 5 men sat around a polished black mahogany table. A real estate developer from New York, his 2 lawyers, and 2 men Solene didn't recognize but instinctively guessed represented some kind of organization. She sat in the corner with a notebook in hand, introduced as Mr. Cross's new secretary. No one paid her any attention. That was exactly what Stellan wanted. Solene watched in silence as the real estate developer presented a luxury housing project in the Chicago suburbs. His name was Morrison, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit with a smile that was too wide. He talked about numbers, about profits, about long-term vision. His voice was smooth as honey, but Solene saw other things. Morrison licked his lips every time he mentioned investment figures, a sign of anxiety. His eyes flicked to the right whenever he spoke about projected profits, a signal of invention rather than recall. And most telling of all, his right hand kept touching his collar, a self-soothing gesture common when someone is lying. The 2 unidentified men were different. They sat motionless, eyes fixed on Stellan, utterly uninterested in the presentation. They weren't here for real estate. They were here to assess, to observe, and they were far more dangerous than Morrison. The meeting ended after 1 hour and 30 minutes. Stellan made no decision, only said he'd consider it and be in touch. When everyone had left, he closed the conference room door and turned to Solene. Go on. Solene drew a deep breath. Morrison is lying, she began, her voice steadier than she felt. About the investment numbers and projected profits. He shows anxiety whenever money comes up. I think his project is in financial trouble. He's likely already lost investors and is desperate for new capital. Stellan said nothing, only watched her. His lawyers know he's lying, Solene continued. They avoid eye contact whenever he exaggerates figures, but they don't intervene because they're paid to stay quiet, not to tell the truth. And the other 2? Stellan asked. Solene hesitated for a second. They don't care about real estate. They were there to evaluate you. They assessed you throughout the meeting, how you reacted, how you spoke, how you withheld decisions. I don't know who they are, but they're dangerous. Especially the man with salt and pepper hair. He watched you like he was searching for a weakness. Silence. Stellan studied her with an unreadable expression. Then he did something that nearly made Solene fall from her chair. He smiled. Not the cold or mocking smile she'd seen before, but a real one, fleeting, yet powerful enough to transform his scarred face. Morrison is on the brink of bankruptcy, he said. 2 major investors pulled out last month. He's desperate. And the other 2 are representatives of a Detroit Mafia family. They're weighing an alliance or a war. You read everything correctly. A wave of relief and pride washed over Solene, but she held it back. I learned from the best, she replied, keeping her tone even. Stellan looked at her for a long moment, his eyes holding something Solene didn't dare name. You're a single mother, he said slowly. You learned to read people because survival demanded it. That's why you're good. That's why I chose you. And as he turned away, Solene realized her heart was beating faster than usual, not from fear, but from something else. Something she knew she shouldn't be feeling. 1 month passed, and Solene had grown accustomed to the new rhythm of her life, to the tense meetings, to reading people and analyzing situations, to Stellan's presence, to the way he looked at her when her assessments were accurate, to the brief moments when their eyes lingered on each other longer than necessary. But she never grew used to this. That night, Solene returned to the apartment later than usual. A meeting with an investment group from Los Angeles had dragged on until nearly 10 o'clock, and she was so exhausted she only wanted to collapse into bed. But when she pushed open the apartment door, she heard it, singing, low, warm, floating from Fern's room. Solene froze. She knew that voice. She'd heard it give orders in meetings, heard it turn cold when facing enemies, heard it soften when speaking to Fern, but she'd never heard it like this. She moved quietly toward her daughter's room, each step feeling as if she were walking on air. The door was ajar, and through the narrow opening she saw a sight that made her heart stop. Stellan was sitting in the rocking chair beside Fern's crib, the child cradled securely in his arms. The soft yellow glow of the nightlight wrapped around them like a thin veil, and he was singing, a song in Italian. Solene didn't understand the words, but she didn't need to. The melody told her everything. It was a lullaby, sad and beautiful and filled with love. Stellan's voice wasn't perfect, slightly rough on the higher notes, but it carried something Solene had never heard from him before: tenderness, vulnerability, longing. Fern had been asleep for some time, her breathing even, her lips parted slightly, one small hand clutching Stellan's finger. But he didn't stop. He kept singing, eyes closed, as if the song wasn't only for the child but for someone else, someone long gone. Solene stood there, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. Tears streamed down her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. She wasn't crying from sadness. She was crying because she was witnessing something sacred, something perhaps no one else had ever seen, the true soul of Stellan Cross. The song ended on a long, low note. Stellan opened his eyes, and in that moment, before he could rebuild the walls, Solene saw it. Pain, deep and ancient and never healed. Then he realized she was there. His eyes met hers through the narrow gap of the door, and they both froze. Solene thought he would be angry, thought he would stand and walk away without a word, as he always did when someone came too close. But he didn't. He just looked at her, his gray eyes softening in the darkness in a way she'd never seen before. "My mother used to sing this song," he said, his voice low and hoarse, "every night, until she couldn't sing anymore." Solene pushed the door open and stepped inside, her legs moving as if they had a will of their own. She sat down on the floor beside his chair, close enough that she could touch him if she wanted to. "When did she die?" she asked softly. "When I was 12, Stellan looked down at Fern, his fingers unconsciously stroking the child's soft hair. "My father killed her, beat her to death right in front of me." Solene's blood turned to ice. She wanted to say something, but there were no words. No words could ease a pain like that. "I tried to save her," Stellan continued, his voice sounding far away. "I was 12 years old and I tried to push him off, but I wasn't strong enough. All I could do was hold her while she died, and this song was the last thing she ever sang to me." Solene's tears fell harder. She didn't try to stop them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I'm so sorry." Stellan looked at her, and in his eyes was something she didn't dare name. "You shouldn't have seen this," he said. "No one should." "Why not?" "Because it makes people think I'm a good man," he replied bitterly. "I'm not a good man, Solene. I'm a monster. I've killed more people than you could ever imagine." Solene looked at him, straight into those shadowed eyes, and said what she knew was true. "Fern doesn't think you're a monster. She looks at you like you're her whole world. Children are never wrong about things like that." Stellan said nothing. He just stared at her for a long moment that felt endless. Then he did something that made Solene's heart stop. He lifted his hand and wiped the tears from her cheek, gently, tenderly, as if she were something precious. "You're crying too," he said softly. "You're the first person who's cried for me in more than 20 years. And Solene, sitting there on the floor of her daughter's room, with Stellan's fingers still resting against her cheek, realized that she loved him. She loved the monster, and she didn't know what to do with that truth. They sat in silence for a long time after that moment. Stellan withdrew his hand, but he didn't stand up, didn't leave the way Solene thought he would. Instead, he looked down at Fern, the child still sleeping soundly in his arms, and began to speak. His voice was low and distant, as if he were somewhere else, in another time. "I have a sister," he said. Her name was Thistle. Solene didn't dare move. She was afraid that if she shifted, if she breathed too loudly, he would stop. And she knew, instinctively, that this was something he had never told anyone. She was born when I was 12. Stellan continued, his eyes still fixed on Fern. The same year my mother died. She gave birth to Thistle just 3 months before my father killed her. I think that's why he did it. He was jealous. Jealous because my mother loved us more than she loved him. He paused, his jaw tightening. Solene could see the muscles in his face twitch as he fought to keep control. After my mother died, I raised Thistle, he said. My father didn't care. He was busy building his empire, busy killing people and ruining lives. And I was 12, learning how to change diapers, how to mix formula, how to rock a baby to sleep. I sang my mother's song to her every night. I promised I'd protect her, that I wouldn't let anything happen to her. His voice faltered. Solene felt tears spill down her cheeks again, but she didn't wipe them away. She just sat there, listening, bearing witness to the pain he had carried for 20 years. Thistle grew up. Stellan went on, a bitter smile flickering across his lips. She had my mother's blue eyes. She smiled all the time. She trusted everyone, even the ones she shouldn't have. She was like Fern. He looked down at the child in his arms, and Solene saw something shatter in his eyes, so much like her that sometimes I couldn't breathe. What happened? Solene asked, her voice no more than a whisper. Stellan closed his eyes. When Thistle was 5, my father went to war with another Mafia family. He thought he was untouchable. He was wrong. They attacked at night. I was 17. I was downstairs when I heard the gunfire. I ran for Thistle's room, but he stopped, and when he opened his eyes, they were wet. Solene had never seen him cry. She didn't think he could. I was too late, he said, his voice breaking like glass. She was lying on her bed, blood everywhere. Her eyes were still open. She was looking toward the door, like she was waiting for me to come save her. But I didn't. I promised I'd protect her. And I failed. Tears rolled down Stellan's cheeks, and he didn't bother to wipe them away. He just sat there, holding Fern, crying silently for the sister he'd lost 20 years earlier. I held her all night, he went on, his voice sounding far away. I couldn't let go. I kept thinking if I held her tightly enough, she'd wake up. She'd smile and say my name like she did every morning. But she never did. And your father? Solene asked, even though she already knew the answer. Stellan's eyes darkened, and for the first time that night, she saw the man all of Chicago feared. I killed him, he said, his voice ice cold. 2 years after that night, I was 19. I spent 2 years planning, becoming strong enough, ruthless enough. Then I stabbed him with the same knife he used to beat my mother. I watched him die, and I felt nothing. No regret, no fear, nothing. He turned to Solene, his eyes both frozen and burning. That was the day I became a monster. That was the day I died with Thistle and became what you see now. Solene reached out and took his hand. Stellan looked down at her fingers, as if he couldn't believe she still wanted to touch him after everything he'd just said. You're not a monster, she said, her voice steady despite the tears. You were a 12-year-old child raising his sister alone. You were a brother who lost his sister while trying to protect her. You were a son who took revenge for his mother and sister. That's not a monster. That's a survivor. Stellan looked at her for a long moment, and Solene saw something shift in his eyes. Not much. Just a thin beam of light cutting through the darkness. Fern looks at me like I'm a good man, he said, his voice like a confession. She looks at me the way Thistle used to, and I don't know what to do with that. Solene tightened her grip on his hand. You keep being the man Fern sees, she said. That's all you have to do. And in that room filled with shadow and soft yellow light, with Fern sleeping peacefully between them, Solene saw something perhaps no one else ever had. A tear slid down the cheek of Stellan Cross, and she knew that no matter who he was, no matter what he'd done, she would never be able to abandon him. Everything changed on a Monday morning, 2 weeks after the night Stellan told Solene about Thistle. She was sitting in the office, reviewing documents from the previous meeting, when the door burst open and Keir walked in. Stellan's most trusted guard looked as if he had just run a marathon, sweat beading on his forehead, eyes tight with tension, jaw clenched hard. The boss needs you. Right now, Keir said, his voice urgent. Solene didn't ask questions. She stood and followed him to Stellan's office. When she stepped inside, she saw Stellan standing behind his desk, surrounded by 5 men she recognized as his highest-ranking guards. The air in the room was so heavy it felt like it could be cut with a knife. Harlan Mercer, Stellan said, his eyes locking onto hers. The name dropped into the room like a bomb. Solene had heard of Harlan Mercer. Everyone in Chicago's underworld knew him, the Mafia boss from the South Side, Stellan's sworn enemy. His father had once been an ally of Stellan's father, before Stellan killed his own father and took over the empire. Harlan had sworn revenge. For 20 years, he had waited in silence, building his power quietly. And now, he's mobilizing, Keir said, stepping forward. Our sources say he's contacted at least 3 other Mafia families across the Midwest: Detroit, Milwaukee, Indianapolis. All of them are considering an alliance with him. To do what? Soline asked, even though she already knew. To kill me, Stellan replied, his voice cold as steel. Harlan doesn't want my territory. He wants me dead. He wants to erase everything connected to me from this earth. Soline felt the blood in her veins turn to ice. Everything connected to him, including her, including Fern, will increase security, Stellan continued, turning to his guards. Double the perimeter. No one enters or leaves without my approval. And Soline and Fern's apartment, I want guards on it 24 hours a day. The guards nodded and filed out to carry out the orders. When only the 2 of them remained, Soline stepped closer to Stellan. I should leave, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If Harlan is targeting people around you, then Fern and I shouldn't be here. We only make you more vulnerable. We're your weakness. No, Stellan said immediately, his voice sharp as a blade. You're not going anywhere. Stellan, this isn't the time to argue. He stepped closer, close enough for her to see every line of the scar on his face, close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. Where do you think you'd be safest? He asked. Out there alone with an 11-month-old child? Or here, inside the most heavily guarded estate in Chicago, with an entire army ready to die for you? Soline wanted to argue, wanted to say she'd survived alone for years. But she knew he was right. She couldn't protect Fern from men like Harlan Mercer. She couldn't even protect herself. Why? She asked, her voice weakening. Why do you care so much about us? We're nothing. I'm just a cleaner you picked up. Why do you? Because she looks at me like I'm a good man. Stellan cut in, and for the first time Soline heard something other than cold authority in his voice. Because you were the first person to cry for me in 20 years. Because, when I'm with you and that child, I feel like maybe, just maybe, I'm not entirely a monster. He lifted his hand and touched her cheek, gentle in the same way he had been that night in Fern's room. You're not leaving, he said, his voice both an order and a plea. You stay here. With me, let me protect you and the child. Soline looked into those burning gray eyes and knew she couldn't refuse. Not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to. All right, she whispered. We'll stay. And when Stellan pulled her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, Soline knew that no matter what came next, she would never regret this decision. 3 days later, they found the mole. Keir uncovered the irregularity while reviewing incoming and outgoing calls within the estate. An unfamiliar number kept appearing in the records tied to Corbin, one of the guards who had served Stellan for 8 years. Encrypted messages, calls made at strange hours, money transferred into a hidden offshore account. The evidence was as clear as daylight. Soline wasn't allowed anywhere near the basement where Corbin was being held. Stellan forbade her from going close, but she heard enough from Mrs. Thornbury, who had been shaking all morning after accidentally passing by the basement door. The screaming, she whispered, her face drained of color. I've never heard screaming like that. Soline didn't ask more. She didn't want to know. But when Stellan returned to the office that afternoon, she saw blood on his sleeve, blood he didn't bother to wipe away. He stood by the window with his back to her, silent for 10 minutes before he spoke. He confessed, Stellan said, his voice low and exhausted. 3 months. He's been selling information to Harlan for 3 months. Soline swallowed hard. What did he tell him? Everything. Stellan turned, and Soline saw darkness in his eyes deeper than ever. My schedule, my meetings, business plans, and... He stopped, his jaw tightening. And you, and the child. Soline's heart felt like it was being crushed. Harlan knows about us. He knows everything. Stellan walked toward her, each step heavy, as if he were carrying the weight of the world. He knows you live here. He knows Fern is my weakness. He knows I'd do anything to protect you both, and he'll use that against me. Fear surged in Soline's chest. Not fear for herself, fear for Fern. Her daughter was only 11 months old. She knew nothing of the underworld, of mafia wars, of men willing to kill a child for revenge. What happened to Corbin? She asked, even though she already knew the answer. Stellan looked at her, and there wasn't a trace of regret in his eyes. He's no longer a concern. Soline nodded. She wasn't as horrified as she thought she would be. Maybe because she'd known who Stellan was from the beginning. Maybe because she understood that in this world, betrayal was paid for in blood. Or maybe because when she thought about someone selling information about her daughter to an enemy, she felt no mercy at all for the traitor. "I'll protect you both," Stellan said, taking her hand. "I promise. Even if it costs me my life, I won't let Harlan touch you or the child." Soline looked into his eyes and saw the burning resolve there. She knew he meant it. She knew he would keep that promise, and that terrified her more than anything else, because she didn't want him to die. She didn't want to lose him. Not now. Not when she had only just found him. "Don't die for us," she said, her voice breaking. "Live. Live for Fern. Live for me." Stellan looked at her for a long moment, and she saw something soft pass through those steel-gray eyes. He didn't speak. He just pulled her into his arms, holding her tight as if it might be the last time. And Soline, standing there in the embrace of a man who had killed with his own hands, realized she wasn't afraid of him anymore. She was only afraid of losing him. 1 week after Corbin, Stellan had to travel to meet the Mafia bosses in Milwaukee to negotiate, a meeting meant to stop an alliance between them and Harlan Mercer. Soline wanted to go with him, but he refused. "It was too dangerous," he said. "You stay here with Fern. I'll be back before midnight." She didn't argue, but she didn't sleep either. She sat in the living room of the apartment, eyes fixed on the door, counting each minute as it passed. 10 o'clock, 11 o'clock, 11:30, no news. Her phone was clenched in her hand, the screen still dark. When the apartment door finally opened close to midnight, Soline shot to her feet. Stellan stepped inside, and her heart dropped into her stomach. Blood. On his shirt, on the sleeve of his jacket, on his neck, and a long cut ran along his left arm, blood seeping through torn fabric. "Oh God!" Soline rushed to him. "You're hurt. You need to go to the hospital. It's just a scratch." Stellan cut in, his voice tired. The negotiation didn't go as planned. One of their guards decided to prove his loyalty by pulling a knife. He isn't alive to regret it. Soline didn't care about the dead man. She cared about the man standing in front of her, bleeding, pretending everything was fine. "Sit down," she ordered, her voice firmer than she intended. "Now." Stellan raised an eyebrow, clearly surprised that she dared give him an order. But he didn't argue. He sat on the sofa, looking at her with eyes heavy with exhaustion, and something else she didn't dare name. Soline grabbed the first aid kit from the bathroom and returned. She sat beside him, carefully removing his jacket and tearing open the sleeve of his shirt to examine the wound. The cut was about 15 centimeters long, not too deep, but it needed care. She worked in silence, cleaning the blood, disinfecting, bandaging. Her hands didn't shake, even though her heart was pounding. She had learned these things in medical school, before her life had fallen apart. She never thought she would use them, especially not on a Mafia boss. "You're stubborn," Stellan said suddenly, breaking the silence. Soline looked up, her eyes meeting his. He was watching her with an expression she had never seen before. Soft, gentle, as if she were something precious. "I learned from the best," she replied, trying to keep her voice steady while her heart hammered in her chest. Stellan didn't smile. He just kept looking at her, gray eyes searching her face. "You were worried about me," he said. Not a question. A statement. Soline stopped what she was doing and looked at him. "Of course I was worried," she said, her voice softening. "Did you think I wouldn't be when you walked into a den of wolves alone?" "Why? Because I care about you," Soline said, and for the first time, she didn't try to hide it. "Because Fern needs you. Because I need you. Because if something happened to you, I don't know what I would do." Silence. Stellan studied her for a long moment, long enough for her cheeks to heat, long enough for regret to begin creeping in. Then he lifted his hand, the uninjured one, and touched her cheek, gentle the way he had been that first night in Fern's room. "I shouldn't do this," he whispered, and Soline could feel his warm breath against her lips. "You deserve better than a man like me." "I don't care what I deserve," Soline answered, her voice trembling. "Let me decide." And then he kissed her, softly, carefully, as if she might break if he wasn't gentle. His lips were warm against hers, and Soline felt the world dissolve around them. There was only him and her, in the apartment washed in golden light, with the scent of blood and antiseptic still hanging in the air. When he pulled back, his forehead rested against hers, gray eyes looking into hers with something she finally dared to name. "Love, I'll protect you," he whispered. "With my life." And Soline, her heart bursting in her chest, pulled him down and kissed him again. This time not gently, this time filled with longing and desperation, and everything she had been holding back for so long. She didn't need him to die for her. She needed him to live, to hold her like this, to live to kiss her like this, to live to look at her as if she were his entire world. Everything happened on a Tuesday night, 3 days after their first kiss. Soline was sitting in Stellan's office, reviewing contracts he needed her to analyze. Fern was asleep in the apartment with Miss Hayashi on watch. Stellan sat behind his desk, gray eyes focused on the laptop screen, but every so often he looked up at her. Brief glances, thin smiles that flickered and vanished. Small moments only the two of them understood. The past 3 days had felt like a dream. Stellan was still Stellan, cold and ruthless to the outside world. But with her he was different. A brush of fingers when passing in the corridor, a stolen kiss in an empty hallway, a look filled with tenderness when he thought she wasn't paying attention. Soline didn't know what they were doing. She didn't know where this was going, but she knew she didn't want it to end. She was happy. For the first time in many years, she was truly happy. And that was when the world exploded. The sound came first, a sharp whistle tearing through the air, like death itself drawing breath. Then the floor-to-ceiling glass wall of the office shattered. Glass sprayed inward like hail. Soline screamed, instinctively throwing her arms up to shield her face. She didn't make it in time. Stellan vaulted over the desk, his body slamming into hers, driving her to the floor and covering her with his own. Glass sliced into his back. She heard fabric tear, felt his body tense with pain. But he didn't move. He only wrapped her tighter, lowering his head, his mouth close to her ear. "Stay still," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Don't move." Gunfire erupted. Not a single shot. Dozens. From outside, from the courtyard below, from every direction. Screams, running footsteps, engines roaring. The estate was under attack. Stellan pulled out his phone and dialed without looking. "Hayashi." His voice was steel cold despite the blood running down his back. "Lock the safe room. Now. Protect the child with your life." He ended the call and looked down at Soline, gray eyes burning in the darkness. "Listen to me," he said, low and urgent. "You're going to crawl to that door. You're going to run back to the apartment. You're going into the safe room with Fern. The code is 0815. Do you remember it?" Soline nodded, her heart hammering in her chest. "But what about you?" "I'll handle it," Stellan replied, and when he lifted his head, she saw the gun appear in his hand as if by magic. "Go. Now." "I can't leave you here alone," Soline said, her voice shaking. "I can't. You can." Stellan cut in, his eyes locking onto hers. "You will. For Fern. She needs you. She can't lose her mother. Fern." Her daughter's name cut through the fog of panic in Soline's mind. The baby was in the apartment. She was scared. She needed her mother. "Go," Stellan said again, and this time his voice softened, gentle the way it was when he spoke to Fern. "I'll find you later, I promise." Soline wanted to say something, wanted to tell him she loved him, that he had to live, that she couldn't lose him, but there was no time. The gunfire was closer now. The screams were spreading through the estate, and Stellan was already on his feet, his back streaked with blood, the gun in his hand, moving toward the shattered window. She heard his voice ring out into the darkness, cold and lethal, stripped of every trace of the man who had kissed her 3 nights before. "You've just made the last mistake of your lives." Then the gunfire thundered, and Soline crawled for the door, tears streaming down her face, her heart breaking as she left him behind. She ran through the corridors, glass cutting into her feet, blood marking the marble floor. She didn't care. She thought only of Fern, of Stellan, of his promise. "I'll find you later." He had to keep it. He had to live. Because if he died, she didn't know how she would go on living at all. Soline ran like she'd never run before in her life. The corridor stretched on endlessly, lights flickering as the power system faltered under the attack. Gunfire echoed from every direction, screams cutting through the air, glass shattering, flesh slamming into flesh. The estate had become a battlefield. She turned into the hallway leading to the east wing, where her apartment and Fern were waiting. 50 meters, 40, 30. Then she stopped as if she'd hit an invisible wall. 2 men blocked the corridor ahead, dressed in black, faces hidden behind masks, guns in their hands, and they were looking straight at her. "There she is," one of them said, his voice thick with satisfaction. "The prize the boss wants." Soline's blood froze in her veins. She stepped back. Once, twice, but there was nowhere to run. Behind her was the long, empty corridor. In front of her were 2 killers Harlan Mercer had sent. She was trapped. "Take her," the second man ordered. "Alive. The boss wants her breathing." They advanced, and Soline knew she had to do something. She couldn't let them take her. Couldn't let them use her as leverage against Stellan. Couldn't let Fern lose her mother. Her eyes darted around, desperate for anything she could use. A vase, a picture frame, anything. But before she could move, a dark shape exploded out from behind her. Stellan. He moved like a ghost, fast and lethal. Before the 2 men could react, he was between them. A punch to the first man's throat. The man folded, choking, his gun clattering to the floor. The second fired a shot, but Stellan twisted, the bullet grazing his shoulder. Then he grabbed the gunman's arm and wrenched it hard. Bone snapped with a dry crack. A scream tore out, and then silence, as Stellan finished them both with their own weapon. 2 shots. 2 bodies hitting the floor. It all happened in less than 10 seconds. Soline stood there shaking, unable to process what she'd just seen. She'd always known Stellan was dangerous. She'd always known he was a killer. But seeing it with her own eyes was something else entirely. He was brutal. He was merciless. He was death wearing a man's skin. And he'd just killed 2 people to protect her. "Go," Stellan said, his voice steady. He grabbed her hand and dragged her into a run. Blood streamed from his shoulder, from his back. But he didn't slow down. They ran through the corridors, past bodies strewn across the floor, past pools of blood still warm on the marble. Soline didn't look. She fixed her eyes on Stellan's back, on the hand gripping hers, and she ran. When they reached the apartment, the door was already open. Ms. Hayashi stood inside, a gun in each hand, her face unnervingly calm. "Where's Fern?" Stellan demanded. "Safe room," Hayashi replied. "She's asleep. I gave her a mild sedative." "In." Stellan shoved Soline toward the steel door at the back of the apartment. "The code," he reminded her. With trembling fingers, Soline punched in the 4 numbers. 0815. The door opened with a heavy click. Inside, Fern lay on a small bed, eyes closed, breathing slow and even. She had no idea about the nightmare unfolding outside. No idea about blood and death and violence. Soline rushed to her, clutching her daughter as tears streamed down her face. Fern slept on, unmoving. Inside, Stellan told Hayashi. "Protect them. And you?" Hayashi asked. "I've got work to do." Stellan turned to Soline, and for one brief moment the ice in his face melted away. All that remained was the man who'd sung Fern to sleep, who'd kissed her under warm yellow light, who'd looked at her like she was his entire world. "I'll come back," he said. "I promise." Then the steel door closed, and Soline could only sit there holding her daughter, listening to the gunfire outside, and pray. "Please let him live," she whispered into Fern's soft hair. "Please let him come back to us." 20 minutes passed like 20 years. Every gunshot was a knife in Soline's heart. Every scream a curse. She had no idea what was happening beyond the steel door. No idea if Stellan was alive or dead. No idea if the room would hold. All she could do was pray. And wait. The silence came suddenly. A minute ago there had been gunfire, screams, chaos, and now there was nothing. Only a heavy silence pressing down on Soline's chest like lead. She sat in the corner of the safe room, Fern still in her arms, her eyes locked on the steel door. Ms. Hayashi stood in front of it, gun still in hand, her stance ready, alert. No one spoke. No one dared breathe too loudly. Then came footsteps. Slow, heavy, drawing closer. Soline tightened her grip on Fern, her heart hammering wildly. She didn't know who was coming. She didn't know if it was Stellan or one of his enemies. She didn't know whether the door would open to save her or to kill her. 3 knocks echoed against the steel. Then a voice, low, hoarse, exhausted, but alive. "Open the door. It's me." Soline broke down before she even realized she was crying. She set Fern gently on the bed and rushed forward, her fingers shaking as she entered the code. The door swung open, and Stellan stood there. He looked like he'd walked out of hell. Blood covered him, his shirt, his face, his hands, his hair. A deep cut on his forehead bled into his eye. His shoulder was torn open, raw flesh visible beneath shredded fabric. His expensive suit was reduced to ruined scraps. But he was standing. He was breathing. He was alive. Stellan. Soline threw herself into his arms, not caring about the blood, not caring about anything except that he was here, that he was alive, that he'd come back like he promised. Stellan held her so tightly she could barely breathe. His body was shaking, not from cold, not from blood loss, but from something else, something she'd never seen in him before. "I'm sorry," he whispered into her hair, his voice breaking. "I'm sorry. My world, my danger, it's all my fault. You shouldn't have had to go through this. Fern shouldn't have. Shh." Soline pressed her fingers to his lips. "We're fine. You protected us. You saved us. I put you in danger." "No, Harlan Mercer put us in danger, and I'm guessing he isn't a problem anymore." Stellan's eyes darkened for a brief moment. "No, he isn't a problem anymore." Then his gaze softened as he looked toward the small bed in the room. Fern was awake. She sat up, blue eyes wide, staring at the blood-covered man standing in the doorway. Soline feared Fern would be scared, that she'd cry at the sight of him like this. Blood, wounds, the shadow of death clinging to him. But Fern didn't cry. She crawled down from the bed and toddled toward Stellan, arms reaching up to be held. Stellan bent and lifted her, despite the bleeding arm, despite the exhaustion weighing down his body. Fern wrapped her arms around his neck like always, her cheek pressed to his shoulder. Then she pulled back, staring at the cut on his forehead, her tiny face scrunching with concern. And then she spoke. "Aoi." One word. Clear. Perfect. Fern's first word. Soline froze. Ms. Hayashi froze. The world seemed to stop turning. Fern touched the wound on Stellan's forehead, gentle, careful, as if afraid of hurting him. "Aoi," she said again, her voice full of worry. Hurt. Stellan looked down at the child in his arms, and Soline saw something she never thought she would. Tears. Sliding down Stellan Cross's face. The man who'd killed more people than she could imagine that night was crying because an 11-month-old baby had spoken her first word. "Her first word," she said. He whispered, his voice breaking. "Her first word is Aoi." "Aoi," Fern repeated, patting his cheek as if trying to comfort him. "Aoi." Stellan clutched her close, his eyes squeezing shut as the tears kept falling. He didn't hide them. He didn't try to be strong. He just stood there, bloodied and broken, holding a child who wasn't his by blood but loved him without condition, and he cried. "I'm okay, little one," he whispered. "I'm okay." Soline stepped closer and wrapped her arms around both of them, and they stood there together in the steel-safe room, with the smell of blood and gunpowder heavy in the air, with the distant wail of sirens beginning outside. A family, broken and bloody and imperfect, but a family. "Stay with me," Stellan said, his voice like a plea. "Both of you, stay with me. Let me protect you. Let me love you. Let me be something other than a monster." Soline lifted her face to his, looking into eyes filled with tears and pain and fragile hope. "You already are," she said. "You have been for a long time. You just didn't see it." Fern tightened her arms around both of their necks as if she never wanted to let go. "Aoi," she said again, then suddenly smiled. "All better." And even though Soline didn't know where Fern had learned that, didn't know how she understood it, she knew Fern was speaking to Stellan. "It hurts, but it'll be okay. Everything will be okay." 6 months later. Summer in Chicago glowed with golden sunlight and a soft breeze. The gardens of the Cross estate were filled with roses and lavender, their gentle fragrance drifting through the air. Soline stood on the veranda, looking out at a scene she'd never dared to believe could belong to her just 6 months earlier. "She's running," she called out, a bright smile spreading across her face. Fern, 17 months old, was toddling across the lush green lawn. Her tiny legs wobbled but stayed determined. 2 little braids bounced with every step. Her clear laughter rang out like wind chimes. She was no longer frail and pale like before. Her cheeks were rosy. Her eyes sparkled with life. Her health had improved so much thanks to proper care. "I've got you now." Stellan appeared from behind a rose bush, bending to scoop Fern into his arms. He spun her through the air, and Fern burst into delighted laughter, the happiest sound Soline had ever heard. Today, Stellan wore jeans and a simple white shirt, far from the expensive suits he wore in meetings. The scar on his face was still there. The wound on his forehead had become a fresh scar, but his eyes were different. no longer cold like ice, no longer empty like an abyss. There was light in them. There was life. There was love. "Daddy!" Fern shouted, clapping her hands against Stellan's cheeks. "Daddy, daddy, daddy!" Stellan froze, even though he'd heard the word many times over the past month. Since Fern began calling him that, he never got used to it. Every time, his eyes shimmered. Every time, he held her a little tighter. "She calls me Dad," he said to Solin as she came to them. "She calls me Dad, because you are her dad." Soline replied, wrapping her arms around both of them, "In every way that truly matters." Stellan looked at her, and in his gaze was everything he didn't say out loud: gratitude, love, devotion, and a silent promise that he'd protect them until his final breath. He was still Stellan Cross, still the ghost who ruled Chicago's underworld, still dangerous, still ruthless to his enemies. But to the two women in his arms, he was someone else: a father, a lover, a man learning how to live again after 20 years of merely existing. Fern clapped her hands against both Stellan and Soline, grinning widely. Daddy, Mommy, love. 3 simple words, yet they held an entire world. They laughed, all 3 of them, standing there in the sun-drenched garden, holding one another, laughing. A family built not by blood, but by choice, by love, by the belief that everyone deserves to be saved. Sometimes light comes from the darkest places. Sometimes salvation comes from the small hands of a child. And sometimes monsters don't need to be destroyed. They just need to be loved. Today's story has come to an end, but its message remains. In life, sometimes the people who seem the most dangerous are the ones who need love the most. Sometimes hearts that seem long dead can be reborn through the trusting gaze of a child. And sometimes we find family in the places we least expect. If this story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, like this video, and share it so more people can listen to meaningful stories every day. How did this story make you feel? Have you ever met someone who seemed cold on the outside, but hid a warm heart within? Please share with us in the comments below. We truly look forward to hearing the feelings that come from deep within your heart. Thank you for watching until the end of the video. We wish everyone watching good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, happy days with the people you love. Goodbye, and see you again in the next video.